You're very welcome to another episode of the Scaling Your Business podcast. For this episode, I'm joined by Andrew Lynch, the co-founder of Huckletree. Andrew, you're welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for being on as a guest, man. Typical fashion of the show is I start with early influences, getting to know the guests. No different with you. Through my research, I know that you went to Blackrock Secondary School. I'm going to assume that you grew up in Dublin. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but what was life like growing up in Dublin? Any favorite standout memories?
Yeah, no, you're right. That I went to Blackrock. We actually moved from Limerick when I was 5. So both of my parents are from Limerick. So when people say where are you from, I say Dublin-ish. I think the biggest influence from that perspective was obviously being able to head down to Limerick and head down the country on the weekends and on the holidays. So would have spent a huge amount of time in and around Limerick. So that's kind of where my heart is, I suppose. Even though my accent mightn't say that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. It's interesting having the perspective from being a bit of a dub and obviously going to Blackrock, but then also having your wings clipped and having your ego clipped sometimes, and you go down to Limerick with a funny accent. So
Sure.
it's great balance, and I think certainly something that kept me grounded growing up all the way through the Celtic Tiger years, and into my late teens and early 20s.
During your time growing up throughout those years, did you have an idea of what you wanted to be when you grew up, or were you just enjoying life?
Yeah, I did have an idea. Most of my ideas at that time were probably bad in hindsight, but I certainly had ideas. Notions maybe better describes it. But if you think about how most people were geared back in the mid 2000s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, property was the place to be. If you weren't in property, you were doing something wrong. And I went to study. Actually, went down to Waterford, down to WIT, to study quantity surveying, on the basis that, of course, property was where I was at. So no better place than a quantity surveying degree to start. Remember one of our lecturers at the time said, guys, you'll be set up. It was 2006 or 7 at the time, pre-proper crash. And said, lads, there'll be loads of jobs for you. It's great. Property is where it's at, et cetera, et cetera. By 2009, the same guy was trying to explain to us, you've an incredibly transferable degree. The skill set that you've built up in quantity surveying, you can ply your trade at any sort of sector. With the implication being that it's not going to be property. So I quickly realized that property was kind of where I was at, but equally it probably wasn't the development side. So I kind of ended up focusing a bit more on the investment and finance side, which led me to first Liverpool and then London to do my master's in real estate investment.
And before we jump into that, a question I want
Yeah.
to wrap this section up on is impact and influence. People can usually point to a small handful of people that have had a massive impact on their early years. So think young Andrew, if not pre-teen, close friends, acquaintances, teachers, relatives, parents. Can you pinpoint one or two people who you believe had a massive impact on your early years that helped shape the person you've become today?
Yeah, I suppose there's impact both positive and negative. I think on the positive side, I always kind of point at my granddad. My granddad was in property, so that's kind of where the property bug came from. Originally from Kerry, started building houses back in the 60s. And I always kind of saw him as someone I'd like to emulate, certainly from a professional perspective. So that always had a big impact on what I did. And then on the negative side, people always have these stories about teachers who didn't believe in them and all that sort of stuff. So I was from an academic perspective, I was an incredibly lazy kid. I had all the benefits of a great education and very supportive parents and family, but for whatever reason, I never got there on knowing the value of a strong education and a work ethic when I was in school. So, I sometimes joke I had the attention span of a biscuit. and I just couldn't focus, and I suppose it took I was the type of guy who'd go down to the library to study for an exam, and I'd stand up and walk over to the business section of the library and start reading books about nothing to do with the exam. I was so easily led astray. So sometimes I think of some of the teachers that would have said that I was lazy, or Andrew, you'll never do anything and you have to focus, and I kind of use that as a bit of fuel to the fire, so to speak.
Absolutely. Well, talking about that, I'd like to focus on the years between 2009 and 2015. You spent time at three different companies: Parkmaster Investments, JP Morgan, and Cambridge Associates. So, in that 6 year period, the question I have for you is, before you got into co-founding Huckletree, throughout those 6 years, what skills did you think that you improved? Perhaps one or two that you weren't so great at, but you knew were crucial to improve before you moved into that role of starting your own business?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I think one thing people always criticize the kind of corporate life and say, oh, you can do more than just work for a suit and tie, 9 to 5. I quite enjoyed my time in my suit and tie. I think one thing it gives you is incredibly good personal skills. I think life is about people and business is about people, and I think without my ability to navigate the human element of business, which I think I certainly learned, certainly at the likes of JP Morgan and Cambridge Associates, then it would absolutely impact, it would impact your ability to be able to converse and deal with problem situations later on in life. I used to always say at Cambridge Associates, I was very young and then exposed to some incredibly big deals on the private equity and venture side, but also some incredibly high caliber investors and fund managers, which really helped frame my thoughts and frame the way I wanted to work going forward. And even down to the basics, letter writing skills, constructing arguments, constructing points of view, memos, presentations, Excel models, all of those things now that are kind of second nature to me now, would have been formed back in those days, and I wouldn't change it for the world.
Huckletree, rather than me give the 30, 60-second commercial, you'll do a better job. It is yours.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I was just gonna say fire ahead.
Fire away.
Far away.
So Huckletree, our ambition and dream for the last 7 years is to turn Huckletree into the center point of digital innovation in Europe and the world. We do that through a couple of key initiatives. Obviously, workspace is one element. We think the workspace part is the kind of genesis and the seed around building one of the best networked and one of the top ecosystems in the world. But we also do that through events and education and growth initiatives for our members, and part of what we do is really focusing on what the member actually wants. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But yeah, there's lots and lots of other extra bits that we can talk about.
Can you give me an idea of some of your locations?
Yeah, so we started off in mid 2014 from a 37 desk building in Clerkenwell over in London, which we thought was the biggest thing since sliced bread. We were smitten with it. It was our first baby. And through the years, we've grown. Our biggest space now caters for just under 700 people. Wow. And that's located in West London in a place called White City. And then we also have, we opened in Dublin in 2017, which has space for 400 people and maybe 75 companies. So yeah, I think overall now we have about 250,000 square feet across eight different geographies. I think five or six in London, and then one in Manchester and one in Dublin.
So when you're looking at landing net new logos, have you identified like a perfect ICP company, 1 to 10 people, or like anyone and anything?
Yeah, so not the latter. We are quite selective. We kind of often we used to refer to ourselves as a workplace accelerator. The accelerator being you know the genesis of why the member actually wants to join a Huckletree space. Um, we often typically don't get there in a deal when all they want is a desk and a seat, because actually you can get a desk and a seat in Starbucks.
Mm.
There isn't a huge benefit unless we can add value to a member business, and also unless a member business can add value to the other businesses within the community and in the space. So we're really, really specific, and uh, exclusive is probably maybe the wrong word, but it's like a date. There's very seldom a second date unless both parties agree.
Yeah.
Um, so from our perspective, it's very much based on the type of business, the area of business that they're in, how that business fits into the existing ecosystem. Again, so that's just timing. Sometimes the timing's right, sometimes it's wrong. And then what we're doing now, more so, certainly more so post COVID, which is kind of a big trend and a big theme for us, is going down more the thematic route. So instead of it being, broadly an interesting business and an interesting sector, we're actually doubling down on the sector theme. So what we try and do is actually have spaces and locations and essentially buildings focused almost entirely on one sector.
Mm.
And an example of that, for example, is our Westminster space, which is called Public Hall. And we operate that with a GovTech incubator and accelerator called Public. And the only businesses that we will accept are businesses that are revolutionizing the way government operates, or trying to make an impact on the way public service and the civil service is operating. And that can range from fintech, from payments. We have a business trying to digitize the payment of fines, parking fines, all things to do with your parking, to your tax, your insurance, roadside parking. Some things that people think are trivial, but actually, if you look at some of the way these government departments are operated, it's archaic, and they haven't been
Mm.
changed in years and years. So any sector that's ripe for disruption, we'll focus and have a look at, see if we can create a hub and a network that will support the businesses within that sector.
You mentioned the word accelerator once or twice there. Before we move on to the
Yeah.
next session, I'd like to get a brief overview of exactly how you plan over the next 12, 18, 24 months to land net new accounts. Because when you mentioned the word accelerator, I would naturally assume that partnerships have a big role in helping you land new accounts. But what are some other things? That is it referrals the majority come from, networking? Just give me a brief overview of how you plan to land more logos.
Yeah, again, very interesting question. I think has evolved a lot over the last couple of years. I think the businesses that we're dealing with now um, are they want something very different from their workspace. Previously, it used to be, I have a 10-person company or a 20-person company. I need 10 or 20 workstations, and I really buy into what Huckletree is about, and I that's why I want to join. Whereas now, the businesses like us that are doing well, certainly in this market, are the ones that are being incredibly flexible. Flexible on the commercial element. So, the 20-person team now no longer need a 20-person office. They need a 7 or an 8 or a 10-person office, because of this push into this flexible work kind of mantra. So that's the kind of workspace element, which we kind of call the bread and butter a bit. That's not the sexy bit. That's the kind of the bit that it's a must-have for companies now.
Mm.
The kind of sexy, sorry about the phrase, but the sexy bit for us is the sexy bit for us is really sitting down in those conversations and figuring out what those businesses want and need. A lot of it is, Andrew, how do we get our team to want to come in again? And that's the real post-COVID $1 million question. And through COVID, we've gone back to the accelerator point. it's not just about accelerating early stage businesses, because it's not just early stage businesses that we have. I mean, Starling Bank, for example, are one of our members in Dublin. They're a very big business now, and they want something very, very different to the 2-person early stage team, that also sits in the space. But they sit in very different sections of our kind of community. One is a big scale up, raise lots of cash, really trying to expand their footprint across Europe, and are really looking to help their junior staff and incentivize their junior staff to come in and develop their junior staff, and we help them with that. But then the earlier stage businesses are different. They want help with fundraising, help with pitch books, help with hiring, first hiring, CTO hiring, etc., etc. So we try and trade off those two. So when we talk about the acceleration, the acceleration piece, it's not always just about early stage businesses. It's about acceleration and value add, as defined by our members, who are typically at different stages. So when we talk about member acquisition and member retention, it's very much about us being as dynamic as we possibly can, listening to what the feedback and what members at different stages want, and then trying to factor in some of those thoughts and processes into what we give back to members, and therefore how we attract and retain members. A lot of it, as you point out, a lot of it is organic. Some of the bigger businesses, certainly with a lot of FDI in Ireland, a lot of the bigger businesses do come in through, EI and the IDA. Again, it's kind of a well-trodden path now for a lot of big US businesses. They kind of come in through those networks, of which we're obviously very close to. But yeah, Dublin specifically is a small spot. So a lot of our members do come in through referrals. We got a lot of members coming out of certain incubator funds or incubators that are looking to set up. And yeah, we're pretty busy on the ground from a business development perspective too. So it's obviously not all about workspace, but that's kind of where we anchor it.
You're also I'll leave links to both your LinkedIn account and the Huckletree website, and I'll mention that a couple more times, but in wherever you're listening or watching this, but you're also an investor and an advisor to some companies. So the question I have here is, when you look at businesses, and I'll define what a blind spot is in a second, but what's a blind spot that you feel is crucial to eliminate if someone wants to, increase the value of their company? And by blind spot, I mean not paying attention to lead generation, and not having a hiring process, not having an onboarding process, not having a common language in the company. I guess that's roughly what a blind spot is, something that could hold back an otherwise healthy business. Yeah. Is there a common one that you get frustrated at when you look at these, startups that you're like, if you just fix that blind spot, you would be 2, 3, 4x faster growth than you currently are?
Yeah, there's one that jumps out at me, which is a kind of a big one, and it's certainly a bigger one in the last kind of 6 months, I would say, is this obsession with fundraising. Don't get me wrong, fundraising is required. Cash is required for growth, especially if you want to inject some rocket fuel into a business. But what I always say to founders is, stop focusing on the win being the announcement in TechCrunch. That's whilst it's a milestone, and often it needs to be celebrated. A big believer in making sure that you always celebrate the milestones and not just skip ahead. But that's not the goal. The goal, isn't, or shouldn't at least be, raise as much money as I possibly can and get patted on the back and be able to tweet about it, and because that's only when the hard work starts, and people forget, and it's become progressively more easy for good businesses, I will caveat, for good businesses to fundraise, because there is now buckets and buckets of cash floating around the system at the moment, for various reasons, which maybe we can talk about on another 2-hour-long podcast. But it's extremely easy for good, well-led businesses to raise money at the moment, and that's just a fact. And one thing I'm always very conscious of, the pedantic me, is the legals. one thing that most founders, unless you've founded a couple of businesses, where the big blind spot is the focus on the valuation, the focus on how much money you're raising and the valuation, and that being the key, and that being the the one kind of blinkered approach that they're taking to fundraising, and forgetting that actually the other 99 points in a lot of these shareholders agreements or fundraising documents, that's where the money's made and lost, so to speak. So if there was one big piece of advice I'd be telling founders is really get up to speed on the lingo in fundraising documents, the lingo in raising money certainly from venture capital, as opposed to maybe angel, who are a little bit more relaxed, because you can quite easily find yourself doing really well on the valuation, raising loads of money, and then essentially being hogtied by professional investors for years and years and years to come, which can be a bit debilitating and also not the most inspiring way to start off your entrepreneurial journey.
I can imagine. Is there a tool out there that you cannot live without?
You're probably meaning productivity tool and work, but I'm going to bring it back to my personal life. I don't think I'd be able to operate, function maybe, without my Garmin, my watch. Sounds ridiculous, but I'm one of those people who I really like the data. I really like the data, and I do a lot of running. And without my watch, I'd be lost. It's kind of I like retreating into the numbers sometimes in my Garmin app. It doesn't sound like the most interesting thing in the world for most people, I'd imagine, but it creates a bit of a break. It also I get the same dopamine hits as I do in my Garmin app, seeing my various statistics off some of my runs that I do, maybe that some people do off Instagram and Twitter. So with less of the feedback, Garmin isn't as critical. Garmin isn't as critical as some of the comments on Twitter and Instagram most of the time. So I'm pretty content with my Garmin. So yeah, I don't think I could live without my Garmin.
Two final questions for you, Andrew. Have you got your own definition of what success means to you?
That's a good question. I think I'll skirt around the answer, but I think for most people think of success in a very, very different way. Certainly the definition. For me, success is kind of happiness. Again, maybe sounds a bit cheesy, but I have lovely wife, Jen, 2 kids, Edie and Esme. Success now is essentially driven by, I would say, like their happiness. I think once you have kids, you realize that you're no longer the most important thing in the room. And I think one thing it does is having kids gives you a huge amount of perspective on things. And I think success for me, say in 2015, 16, like most people in their early 20s, was essentially kind of defined by, commercial success, money, business success, etc. But I think as I've gotten a bit older, and as the kids have gotten a bit older, you realize actually success is being able to, for example, daily success for me is being optimized and efficient during the day, so I can put the kids to bed, so I can feed them, so I feed them dinner. Making sure that I'm doing enough during the week that I don't anymore have to go crazy on the weekends and spend 14-hour days on my laptop, and I'm able to bring the kids swimming at 3:00 on a Sunday. But I do think you still need to have the fire and the passion to drive a business forward. I think success now for us is about really driving value to our member businesses. We sometimes say that we kind of ride on the coattails of the success stories of our member businesses. And one of those businesses, for example, is a business called Butternut Box, which actually recently expanded into Ireland. They're a dog food, a kind of a dog food, direct to consumer dog food delivery business, and they founded actually by another Irish guy, Kev, and Dave, and are doing incredibly well. And they started with us, I think it was early 2017, with 15 people. They've gone on to raise now over 50 million pounds in funding, and have a 300 person plus team across a couple of geographies. And we followed their journey all the way along. So when I think of success, I think of how amazing it's been to be able to help and add value in some way to some of these businesses that are doing incredible things across the world. Rather than, obviously the security of money and commercial success is important, again, especially when you have kids. But I think as you get a little bit older, you can kind of push that to the side and really focus on the business and the product. And with the goal being that the commercial bit comes later.
Final question for you, Andrew, is if you were the final decision maker in adding a mandatory subject to the secondary school curriculum, what would it be and why?
Oh my God. The first thing that jumps out is, and I don't think this is a subject that's easily taught, but I think going back to one of my answers that maybe at the start is emotional intelligence and the ability for people to be able to converse and deal with other people is so important. And I don't know exactly how you would necessarily teach that in secondary school. Hopefully that's for somebody far smarter than me to figure out. But if we were able to be a little bit more focused on how people interact with each other, and really, we call it cop on in Ireland. It doesn't, that word doesn't necessarily translate, but as my granddad used to say, there's nothing common about common sense. And I think for kids and teenagers to be able to have some sort of footing in dealing in awkward situations, and training, maybe training is the wrong word, but some sort of training in that early on, I think it would save a lot more hassle and create a lot more better grounded people in their late teens and early 20s.
Great answer. Andrew Lynch, co-founder of Huckletree. We'll leave it there. Thanks again for being my guest. I'll leave links to both Huckletree website and your LinkedIn in the description field where you're listening to this. But for today, I wish you continued success. And for today, thanks for being my guest.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.